Hello and welcome to today's episode of Chad O. Jackson Live. Took a little break since last Thursday. Had an event with Colonel Allen West in Dallas, Texas that went really well. We talked about reparations. We talked about the Great Reset. We had a couple of fans of our Cutting Through the Culture show up. So that was a very fun event. I hope to do more events like that in the future, whether it be me solo or whether it be me along with some of the panelists from our Cutting Through the Culture show, or some other personalities that you may be familiar with, or people who you don't know at all. I hope to also produce more content on my YouTube channel where I am interviewing people who grew up prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that's forthcoming. I want to get their perspective, which is unadulterated by the sensationalism of the mainstream narrative, the mainstream prevailing narrative. People who are looking at their genuine experiences apart from the politicization of race in America, and give their genuine thoughts on what life was like prior to this kind of forced integration that we saw as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I have that forthcoming. You guys will get to see some of the interviews that I've done and will do with older Black folks who talk about a time in America, a long lost time, where Black quote unquote culture was something where those who were on the lower rungs aspired to be like their best and brightest, as opposed to what we see now, where those who are in the quote unquote upper echelons or higher rungs of society try to associate and identify with their lowest common denominator so as to get political clout, and so as to play into this kind of victim narrative that we now see running amok in our American context. So today I wanted to talk in that same vein about a recent podcast I've seen with none other than Tavis Smiley. For those of you who don't know, Tavis Smiley is a journalist who used to have a show with PBS. I first found out with him or about him through an interview that he did with Prince back in 2008 or 2009. I grew up in a house where my mother was always a fan of Prince. She always went to his concerts whenever he was in Dallas. She owned all of his records. So, Prince was a very, common record that my parents would go to in my home, particularly my mother. And so I remember her watching an interview with Tavis Smiley and Prince. And that's who I found out who Tavis Smiley was. I've later learned that Tavis Smiley considers himself to be a kind of leader in the so-called, what's up? Tavis Smiley considers himself to be a kind of leader in the so-called Black community, and he was always hosting something called the State of the Black Union, where he would bring all these quote unquote Black leaders together, and they would talk about what they perceive to be the issues that ails Black folks in America, and resolve to do something about those issues. Of course, none of it came to fruition because their premise is wrong, and when you start off on the wrong foot, you can never get to where you're trying to go. It's a futile game, and it's unfortunate that they put a lot of money and time and effort into that nonsense. So this is who Tavis Smiley is, a journalist who considers himself to be a kind of race leader. And this is where that savior complex comes in, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So I wanted to play this clip for you and listen to the language that Tavis Smiley uses, which, in my opinion, is reminiscent of this kind of secular culture, which dominates our society and presumes to hold the kind of moral high ground. In fact, this is the ilk of folks who assume that they are morally superior to all the rest of us, and that they set the tone, they set the standard for what is good, what is wrong, what is right, what is all the things. And one of the mantras, one of the sayings of this particular culture is "be who you are." Right? This concept of being who you are. They promote and glamorize intersectionality, whether you are black, whether you are gay, whether you are a woman. They hold these are things that hold uh, uh, basically high stock in the political capital and the political landscape, and they make much ado about whatever your intersectional identity is, and they promote the virtue of intersectionality by after romanticizing and glorifying and making much of whatever your intersectional identity is. After doing that, they then say be who you are. In other words, be that. If you are black, dig in, lean into your blackness, whatever that is. This term blackness, which is uh, there's a lot more content and things that I hope to produce, even with Uncle Tom 3, that fleshes out this word blackness, at least as the left uses it, and what they mean when they say blackness. So blackness, if that's your identity, they encourage you to lean into that, to embrace that all the more. Gayness, whatever, womanness, they want you to make much to do with that particular intersectionality. And I want you to listen to how Tavis Smiley's language, rather than rejecting that or challenging that, it reinforces that in this first clip.
I think that black people make race the center of their existence. I think the world that we inhabit makes race the centerpiece of our existence. Race is a part of every single thing in America. I don't think that is of our making. That is not of our doing. I would much prefer to wake up every day and be allowed to be seen for who I am. But there's something about this racial construct we have to navigate in and through every single day that makes it difficult to just show up and be who you are.
So he says that basically, and understand that there's a couple things going on here. I'm not sure what's going on with my screen. Let me try this. What in the world? That's weird. Why can't I see the top of my head all of a sudden? Okay, there we go. I'm not sure what was going on with my screen, or if it was just an angle that I was seeing. So let me add this back.
I don't think that black people make race the center of their existence. I think the world that we inhabit makes race the centerpiece of our existence. Race is a part of every single thing in America. I don't think that is of our making. That is not of our.
So first of all, that's false. This concept of black people not making race a part of their existence. Yes, they do. Black people do make blackness a part of their existence. I forget who it was, but there was a person in the audience from the last event that Colonel West and I were speaking at. And this individual was some kind of, she had a position in a college administrative, she had some kind of administrative role in a college, at a college. Where are my words today? She had a college administrative, she had an administrative role at a college here in Dallas. Why was that so hard to say? And she had asked a question, or she was asked a question by another black professor. What does she raise her children to be? And the answer that this woman gave is, well, I raise my children to be Christians and to be, proud Americans. And then she returned the question to the black woman, what do you raise your children to be? And the answer that the black woman gave is, I raise my children to be black. That's not a one-off thing. That is an opinion that is shared by many black people across the width and breadth of this country. This notion of blackness is this thing that has been pushed as a kind of hubris since the 1970s. Black power, black pride. You even see Martin Luther King, prior to him having been assassinated, saying that you should be proud of being black and black is beautiful and this and that. And so this concept of blackness being a source of pride is something that has been pushed by your so-called black leaders for the past 50 years or more. And the thing is, you can't say that, oh, that's society that makes much to do about blackness, when the evidence is more, you know what I mean, to the fact that no, it's actually black people who make much to do about their race. And you know, and you don't really see that going on with other ethnic groups at all. In fact, I've heard it said from black kids who are going to a predominantly white school or what have you, that whenever they're in the classroom and something about race comes up, whether it be, you know, black history or what have you, they don't want to be called on to answer a question because they don't, you know what I mean? Because they don't care to get into that subject matter, and that it hardly ever happens to where they are called on. And to the extent that they are called on, it's because, you know, you have some kind of white professor or white teacher who thinks that they're doing something noble by calling on the black student to chime in on a a conversation having to do with race. And so I will say that to the extent that non-black folks make much to do about race, you'll find that it's mostly white liberals. And it's this kind of thing of virtue signaling that they do. They don't make it about race to the extent that they are being racist on purpose, but they make it about race to the extent that they think that they're doing something good and noble by identifying in this kind of, you know, in this kind of posture of wokeness, what in society, uh, what policy in society, what thing in society, what act in society gives way to disparate outcomes. And so it's to that extent that race is focused on by people who are not black. But if you are black in this country, you are not everybody, you know, not to generalize, but there are a lot of black households where you're taught to look at everything through the lens of being black. And so what Tavis Smiley is asserting here is completely false. Black people make way much more of race than do other people in this country.
Doing, I would much prefer to wake up every day and be allowed to be seen for who I am. But there's something about this racial construct
And so the thing is, he's trying to have it both ways. He's trying to have his cake and eat it too. On the one hand, if you ask Tavis Smiley how he identifies, the very first thing he'll say is black. He said this. I wish I had a clip to show it to you, but he said this, that he takes great pride in his blackness. So on the one hand, you want to be known for your blackness, but on the other hand, you're upset that people see you as black. So how can you win with people with this mentality? Like, how can you get anywhere with people with this mentality? Recognize my blackness, but at the same time, don't see me as a black man. It just doesn't make sense.
I would much prefer to wake up every day and be allowed to be seen for who I am. But there's something about this racial construct we have to navigate in and through every single day that makes it difficult to just show up and be who you are.
So this is the most upsetting thing to me about that clip is you see the gray in his hair and his beard, and he's talking like this. On the one hand, once again, you insist on blackness as your identity, and then on the other hand, you say that it's difficult for you to show up and be who you are. It's difficult to show, you know, for people to see you as who you are. Who you are, by your summation, is black. That's who you said you are. I don't go around identifying as black. I don't go around insisting that people see me as black. And so for me, like, and not only that, I don't focus on how people see me in the first place. This kind of fetish that these grown men have, this kind of concern and being worried about how people see you, like, get over yourself. Who are you? Get over yourself. You think I care about what a stranger thinks about me? Not at all. That doesn't mean that I go around being a degenerate, you know, reckless, you know, kind of frivolous individual in the world. I go around conducting myself with a degree of decency. But whether a person looks at me and the first thing they see is a black man, or the first thing they see is an entrepreneur, or the first thing they see is someone who's decent, that doesn't make me any difference whatsoever. How they see me, like, I have no control over that, nor do I care to have control over that. And to the extent that you do care, I, I mean, I feel sorry for you. I genuinely feel sorry for you if you go around worrying about how people see you. To me, that seems very pathetic. Moving on, though. I wanted to play another thing that Tavis Smiley said, which I think is off-putting for a grown man to be saying. Check this out.
Reason why African Americans still lag far behind in every single leading economic indicator category. And it's not because I'm less than. It's not because I'm being judged on something other than race. It's primarily because of the melanin in my skin. So we can look the other way. We can blame Black people for their own plight. But the reality is that race is a construct in this country. Race is not just a personal reality. It is a political reality. And so long as we try to ignore that, I think we're never going to make progress on the issue.
Where's your proof? Where's your proof? He said that the reason why Black people are lagging behind other groups is because of the melanin in their skin. It's not because of anything that they're doing. It's not because of the culture. It's not because of personal decisions. None of that is a factor in why certain people are lacking behind others. The only reason, says Tavis Smiley, that Black people are lacking behind other groups is because of the melanin in their skin. Where is your proof? See, that's easy to say. That's an easy thing to say. It's an asinine thing to say, but it's a very easy thing to say. But he doesn't qualify it with any proof at all. This to me speaks to the futile, frivolous way in which these leaders conduct themselves on the one hand, and the kind of reinforcement of degeneracy within Black culture on the other hand. Because Tavis Smiley's brand of leadership doesn't call people to account, doesn't call Blacks to account. It doesn't require Blacks to be responsible and to be men and to be virtuous women. It doesn't require anything of them. It just tells them that because you have more melanin in your skin than your white neighbor, you are doomed to despair and just no hope whatsoever. So what do they expect will happen in a context where people believe such a thing? And what's interesting about this is, Tavis Smiley is a wealthy man. Jill Scott, same scenario. Here's a woman who is a wealthy woman who was able to, with her voice, become wealthy in America. There's not a lot of countries where you can use your voice to become wealthy. Not a lot of countries where that can happen. But in America, that did happen. If you have something to bring to the table and you leverage that, you are going to get a return on the fact that you've leveraged that thing, or you've invested that thing into, the market. You're going to get something back from the market. That's the way that it works in America. And so when you hear Jill Scott telling Black children in her rendition of the national anthem that America doesn't smile on you, she said, America doesn't smile on you, Black child. America smiled on her. The meritocracy that is America, becoming less and less so, but the meritocracy that is America smiled on Jill Scott. It smiled on Tavis Smiley. But their message to the masses of Black folks is it's not going to smile on the rest of you. Yet these are people who call themselves leaders. And so for me, it brings your leadership into question. What is it really that you're after? Because your message, although you think it's productive, is actually counterproductive. The melanin in my skin is the reason why I'm not getting ahead. Where's your proof? Can you show me definitive proof that that's the case? Or are you just talking? Of course, he doesn't qualify it. Let's see here.
Race, it's primarily because of the melanin in my skin. So we can look the other way. We can blame Black people for their own plight. But the reality is that race is a construct in this country. Race is not just a personal reality. It is a political reality. Mm-hmm. And so long as we try to ignore that, I think we're never going to make progress on the issue.
Race is not a personal reality. It's a political reality. What are you getting at exactly? I'll tell you. What he's getting at is the fact that when he says race is not a personal reality, it's a political reality, he's suggesting first and foremost that racism is a problem in the first place. That this notion that that Black people are hated is an issue in the first place. So that's the foundation of what it is he's arguing. And from there, when he says it's not a personal reality, he's suggesting that there's nothing that you can do at the personal level to overcome racism, but there is something that you can do at the political level to overcome racism. And that means drastically changing and pushing for policies with the aim of eradicating racism. And that becomes this never-ending thing. Ultimately, what he's arguing for is a socialist system that, in the name of eradicating poverty, in the name of eradicating racism, seeks to render equitable outcomes to where, regardless of what a person is putting in, regardless of the amount of work a person is doing, regardless of the extent to which one is decent or what have you, you still get rewarded from the system. You still get some kind of provision or rations from the system, in spite of your laziness, your idleness, or your ambition and your hard work ethic. Regardless of where you stand on that scale, you still get something positive out of the system. That, in Tavis Smiley's mind, is how racism, quote unquote, is eradicated. So again, just very troubling to hear a grown man making this point. Building on that, I wanted to play this other clip for you where he brings love, this word love, into the conversation.
But love in the center of the public square. Gandhi put love in the center of the public square. But you can't have those conversations, it seems to me, without defining what love is. And for me, I go back again to King and how King would define it. Love simply means this, that everybody is worthy just because. Imagine then how different our public policy would be if everybody were operating off of that fundamental definition of what love is, that everybody is worthy just because. If you ever get to a point in this society where that's the operational definition, it fundamentally changes how we debate these issues. Because if everybody is worthy just because, then it fundamentally changes how we see education, which means then that everybody in America ought to have access to an equal, high quality education. It means that everybody ought to live in an environment that is safe from environmental racism. It means that everybody ought to have access to equal, high quality health care. It means et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So in other words, his definition of love, I mean, he spent more than a minute explaining just that. And that's an edited down version because he talks about even more policies that he thinks are indicative of whether or not a person loves the masses of people. What he is saying love is like if people genuinely love others, and they would want for all these socialist policies to be present in our system. And the fact that they aren't present in our system, the fact that we don't have even more of a welfare state, is indicative of the fact that we don't love one another. So again, they have, in a sense, bastardized and perverted what love is, what the biblical version of the word love is. They have completely bastardized what love is, and they have suggested that a true loving society is one that is Marxist. A true loving society is one that is communist. That's basically what he's saying. Martin Luther King was a Marxist. And if you're using Martin Luther King as your barometer and as your kind of arbiter, if you will, on what is or what is not love, what is or what is not a quote unquote good society, you're not using Jesus. You're not using the Bible. You're using Martin Luther King, who was an agnostic on the question of God's existence, who was an agnostic or an atheist or an agnostic on the question of whether or not Jesus resurrected from the dead. He didn't believe Jesus resurrected from the dead, which is weird that he was a pastor. But, you know, that's neither here nor there. You're using Martin Luther King as the source in your mind as to what is love. And so when you use Martin Luther King to answer the question of what love is, and you're saying that if our government really loved the citizens, then it will push more welfare policies, that will push more socialist policies, then what you're doing is completely dishonest. What you're doing is completely disingenuous. For me, again, very strange that a grown man is making these comments. An older man at that.
So when I talk about King, I want us to make sure we understand what we mean when we say love, because King is oftentimes talking about love. And to my mind, no leader since King has been so adept at putting love in the center of the public square, but that's not some mamby-pamby definition.
That's right.
When you take that definition that we're all worthy just because, it fundamentally changes the way you approach good public policy. Racism is the contestation of my humanity.
Mm.
And in so many ways, we see the contestation of the humanity and the dignity of Black people unabated in this country.
Right.
And so for me, it's always important to kind of bring that full circle.
So he made the point that genuine love is the implementation of a welfare state, an expansive welfare state, i.e. communism and socialism. He made that point. And then he goes on to say that to deny such a state, to deny the welfare state, to deny the socialist state, is to display not love, but hate. And not only that, it's a contestation of my humanity. It's a denial of my humanity. If you don't give me the welfare state, if you don't give me socialism, then you are rejecting and denying and contesting my humanity, says Tavis Smiley. That's basically what he's saying. Again, you will begin to see more rhetoric like this. And what strikes me is the sophistication of it all. Of course, I'm able to translate because I'm able to hear what he's saying. I've studied enough of his ilk, and I've studied enough of what Martin Luther King believed and taught to know that when they say one thing, they mean this. You have to really understand where it is they're coming from, who they read, who their mentors were, what books they've read, what philosophers they love, all the things. You have to really understand that to then interpret properly what it is they mean when they say these things. And so whenever he says, once again, that if our society was a loving society, then we would have more education, we would have equal health care, we will have, this, and that. He's telling you on the one hand that socialism, welfare state equals a society that loves. To reject and to deny such a state, to deny us of these kind of provisions and rations, is to contest my humanity. You'll begin to see this rhetoric being pushed more and more in public schools. In a lot of public schools, it's already being pushed, but I want you to once again pay attention to the sophistication of it all. It shouldn't take me breaking this down and explaining it to you for what Tavis Smiley is saying to kind of jump out and be seen as dangerous and chaos inducing in our society. And not only chaos inducing, it's also inducing of this kind of idleness that we've seen amongst large sects of the so-called Black community in America over the past 60 years. How do you go from the kind of entrepreneurship, the kind of hard work ethic, the kind of ambition that existed amongst young Black men in America prior to the 1960s to this kind of frivolous, degenerate attitude, this kind of laziness that exists among young Black men after the 1960s? If not for the fact that the civil rights kind of rhetoric shifted the mindset, particularly of young Black men, to where they stopped going after entrepreneurship and work ethic and all the things, where they then kind of divested from themselves and invested instead in the welfare state and public policy and what the government will or will not do for them. And this is where you get the Tavis Smileys of the world, who believe that a loving society is one that takes care of them, where they need not do anything. Are y'all getting this? Or do I have to break it down even further? What is love? According to Tavis Smiley, who quotes Martin Luther King, love is when the state takes care of me. That's what love is, according to these people. Trying to figure out where I wanted to go from here. There are a couple of other clips that I think will be useful at this point in the show. So I think I'll take it here.
This class distinction, which for me.
So the point that this young man is about to make, this is John Wood Jr. He has a podcast called Uniting America. So he aims to do just that, unite America. But I'm sorry, young man, but I have no interest in uniting with your version of America that place as its kind of patron saints people like Martin Luther King. I have no interest in uniting with you in that version of America. None at all. But what he tries to do right here, what this young man tries to do right here, is he tries to, in a sense, say that, well, I believe that racism plays a role in society, but at the same time, I don't think it's just race. I think it's also classism. I think it's also this other kind of ism. And so whether you are a young John Wood or whether you are an elderly Tavis Smiley, the result is the same. The blame is the same. It's always something else. It's always someone else. It's never personal responsibility. And even to the extent that these folks do talk about personal responsibility, they place very little stock or very little emphasis on the personal responsibility piece. And they still seek to structure society by way of policy because they have a larger kind of trust and their own kind of ability to social engineer society than they do in one's personal responsibility to make their own way. If it were left up to me, if I were the HUD secretary or what have you, I would make a very strong case against the eradication of the HUD department. I will say we don't need a HUD department. I will go in and kamikaze that department. I will kamikaze the welfare state. Just get rid of it, complete cold turkey. Well, Chad, what about all the people who are, in a sense, addicted to the teat of government welfare? I feel that God has placed within all of us a survival instinct. And my hope is that that will kick in. But I feel that by the elimination of the welfare state, you will then put people in a position where they have to make their own way. And it is the making of one's own way that has this kind of character building impact on people. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I used to be homeless. After I graduated from high school, I thought that I would go to college. So I applied and got accepted to go to a local community college. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And, I figured I would stay home for about a year or so while going to this community college. About halfway through the first semester, my parents split up. So my mom, she moved to Oklahoma, where she's from, and my dad, he decided to travel the country doing work because he owns an excavation company, which left me kind of, without a place to stay. So I lived in my car for about 5 or 6 months. Decided to take a job as a plumber's apprentice, and after I was able to save up a little money, I was then able to get an apartment, and then was able to incrementally kind of grow and expand kind of my status in life to where I am now. Uh, Although I was displeased at the time with the fact that my parents split up, looking back on it now, I think it was a good thing for that to happen at the time that it did. Granted, the backdrop of my upbringing was also necessary. The fact that my dad did teach and emphasize hard work ethic, he did really kind of beat that into us. I'm not saying physically beat, but he did kind of beat this character of hard work ethic into me from a very early age. My brothers and I. So whenever it came right down to it, when I was in a place where I didn't have anyone else to depend on, I did have to kind of figure it out for myself. I did kind of have to, find a way to make a way. And it was through going through that there was a lot of character building that took place. There was a lot of growth that took place by having nothing. I didn't have a welfare check. I didn't have food stamps. I didn't have any of that. I had to make my own way. I had to live on the bare minimum in terms of like what I ate and things of that nature. But I made it through. And I feel like I'm a better man today because of it. And so this is why I have little sympathy for those who are complaining about, not being able to pay their bills and this and that. I have sympathy, but not as much as someone who have never gone through that in their lives. And so I do believe, once again, once you snatch that rug out from under a large sect of our society, sure, you'll have some folks who resort to selling drugs or resort to get into all sorts of nefarious activities so as to make their way and survive. But still more, you'll have a lot of people who decide to go out and get jobs or learn a trade or learn a skill or something of that nature. That all depends on the character of the individual. But I don't feel that it is necessary to kind of prolong this kind of life support that we have under the notion that by snatching the rug from out from under them, you will have a kind of increase in crime or what have you. I don't believe that should be a determining factor. I believe that, and I'm okay with people disagreeing with that. I'm okay with people saying that, well, it should be more gradual. It should be more incremental, a kind of slowly sunsetting the welfare state, if you will. I get the thought process behind such a idea, but I'm more of a cold turkey kind of guy. I'm more of a cut it off now kind of guy. Get it over with, rip the Band-Aid off, maintain a degree of law and order that, to the extent that people do begin to start robbing and doing all the things, we have a place for you, and that place is called jail. That place is called prison. I think that we need to take a more masculine approach to governance in the society instead of taking this kind of weak, more effeminate approach that, in my opinion, prolongs the kind of degeneracy in our society more so than actually doing something about it. So again, I think that to the extent that we begin to look at problems more as a personal responsibility thing and not so much as what someone else is doing kind of thing, we'll be a lot better off. But again, whether it's John Wood or whether it's Tavis Smiley in this particular clip, they both seem to be placing a larger emphasis on an outside source versus on cultural and personal responsibility.
You have this class distinction, which for me explains to some degree why my experience as a Black man may differ from someone else's, because I was born in Inglewood, family in South LA and so forth. I'd go and visit sometimes. And later on in life, I'd marry a woman from the Jordan Downs projects in Watts. I lived in the Jordan Downs projects for about a year or so. You know, I've got deep proximity, but that's different from my cousins and certainly my wife's family who grew up in the hood, who grew up in the projects. The truth is, you know, I'll say this without shame. I grew up a code switcher. You know, I'd speak different ways depending on who I was around. But you get me, you know, around, you know, an institutional, predominantly sort of white kind of, you know, setting, I'm perfectly at ease. And so I bring it to this class question. When I meet Black people who grew up more or less sort of kind of the way I did, and they say racism isn't really a problem in America anymore, but we keep reinventing it through this race industry, right? I have some sympathy on the basis of the fact that I personally can identify in myself a Black experience for whom that's sort of largely true.
Okay.
And yet I don't have to jump far outside of my own direct experience to say, but that's not true for my cousin. That's not true, you know, for brother living down the street and so forth. For them, you know.
So it's not racism then. Let me help you to understand. If you're telling me that I haven't had racism, let me rephrase this. If you're telling me that you haven't experienced racism because you've had it okay in life, but my cousin down the street experienced racism because he hears gunshots and he does this and he does that, then it's not racism. If racism between two Black people has to select a person within that duo that it will impact, then that's not racism. It is at that point that you must begin to look at the personality differences, the mindset differences between the two, and come to the conclusion that it's not in fact racism. It's more or less something that you did that caused a response, whether it be from law enforcement, whether it be from, you know, not getting the job or whatever the case may be. You have to then begin to look at other factors, at what you are doing, not necessarily what you look like. Does that make sense? If racism has to pick and choose who among Black people it will impact, that's not racism. That's something that you are doing. If it was genuine racism, it will affect all of us, not just a few of us. But of course, there are those who will say, well, you know, Martin Luther King did say that, you know, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. BS. We have a system of not only checks and balances, but of due process to ensure that justice is done in the event that one person commits a crime against another. We have a system of due process. Martin Luther King's civil rights movement was unnecessary to the extent that you already had Jim Crow laws being repealed at the local and state levels. You already had that happening, even in some of the more harder states like Alabama, like Mississippi. I can show you the records of instances where these laws were being repealed, where these regulations of Jim Crow were being repealed. And so it's not only the fact that when it comes to this thing we call racism, or when it comes to crime in particular, you have a system of due process in place to ensure that justice is done. You also have a system of checks and balances that, to the extent that bad law is passed at the local, state, or federal level, you then have the judiciary, body, which is meant to contest or to consider rather the constitutionality of a law, of a regulation. And so it's more important to ensure that judges themselves are just than to try to enact or to try to carry out this kind of street justice, which is more, which is more a kind of mob justice than anything. And so again, what he is hold on, let me play this right back real quick.
When I meet Black people who grew up more or less sort of kind of the way I did, and they say racism isn't really a problem in America anymore, but we keep reinventing it through this race industry, right? I have some sympathy on the basis of the fact that I personally can identify in myself a Black experience for whom that's sort of largely true.
Okay.
And yet I don't have to jump far outside of my own direct experience to say, but that's not true for my cousin. That's not.
Okay. So that's where you lose me. That's where you go off the rails. You say that I can say for myself that racism hasn't been a factor because everything that I went after in life, I've been successful at, and I haven't seen any kind of race pushback. But then he says, but that's not true for my cousin. And watch what he says to qualify this notion that he puts out that it wasn't true for my cousin. He's not going to say that, somebody called my cousin a nigger. He's not going to say that a white man showed special favor to a white person, and then my cousin who had the same kind of qualities and same kind of achievements as this white person, my Black cousin was shown disfavor by that same white man who just previously showed the white person favor. He's not going to say anything like that. Listen to what he says to qualify this idea that his Black cousins did experience racism that he himself did not experience.
Exactly.
True, for brother living down the street and so forth. For them, American history goes from slavery to Jim Crow to the assassinations of Black leadership in the 60s to mass incarceration to a life where my wife, who grew up in the Jordan Downs projects, her earliest memory of American life was having to lay on the floor, in the midst of gunshots and fires and sirens. Of a woman who's seen more death in her life in the projects than many people serving in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Who's doing the killing in the projects? Who is doing the killing in the projects? You just said that your cousins, your wife who used to live in the projects, the homie down the street, they have experienced racism. And then you bring up something completely irrelevant, how history goes from slavery to Jim Crow and then today. Like, what does that have to do with anything? And then you say that they experience on a daily basis, seeing people get shot, having to hide on the floor. Like, who is doing this destruction in the projects? Is it the white man or is it Black people killing other Black folks? So I'm still trying to understand where racism plays a role in what it is you're trying to say. You see, here's an example of somebody trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, you said that you sympathize with those who say that racism doesn't play a factor in the lives of Black folks. You said you sympathize with that because that's been your own experience. But then you try to assume that it does play a role in the less fortunate among us because they live in situations where they see shootings and all the things. But you still don't I'm sorry, but I can't take you seriously in your quote unquote having seen it both ways, because even to the extent that you're trying to convince me that racism exists in the lives of these other folks, it's still not racism that we're referring to. It's still not racism. What am I missing here? Well, I'll let you continue explaining.
And she got out, but for people who are still in that environment in 2022, across this whole arc of American history, I ask people, I say, when does the American dream ever show up for disproportionately many?
It shows up when you decide to do something about your situation. It shows up when you make the conscious decision that Black culture or hood culture hasn't fared very well for you, and that it's now time to reject hood culture, to reject Black culture, and begin to become a decent person, to focus on a skill, to focus on a trade, to focus on just becoming decent, that you might then elevate your status in life. That's when the American dream becomes a reality for you. It doesn't just become a reality because Tavis Smiley helped pass some legislation that adds yet another socialist policy with the intention of elevating black folks. That's not how you come into the American dream. You come into the American dream when you decide to be a decent person, when you decide to pursue an ambition or pursue a skill or pursue a trade, when you decide to elevate your status in life instead of depending on public policy or legislation to do it for you. That's when it becomes a reality. You just said that your wife made it out of the hood. What did she do to make it out of the hood? Is it something that Obama did? Is it something that Tavis Smiley did? Or did she do something to get out of the hood? Or did her parents, did her dad make the decision that this isn't the environment that I want my family to live in? So he made the decision to do the things necessary, take personal responsibility to get his family out of the hood. Help me understand this. And then to the extent that you said these were your cousins, right? You had some cousins that lived in the hood and that you didn't. So your cousin's experience is different than your experience. And your cousins experienced racism and you haven't experienced it. The fact that they are your cousins means that you have a parent who is a sibling to your cousin's parent. So at one point, your mom or dad was in the same household as your cousin's mom or dad. So they grew up under the same roof by the same parents who taught them the same lessons. And so why is it that you grew up outside of the hood and your cousin grew up in the hood? If not for the fact, like what is the explanation for that? Besides the fact that your parents had one mindset and your cousin's parents chose a different mindset. The mindset that your cousin's parents chose left them in the hood. The mindset that your parents chose took you out of the hood. Are you understanding this? I know a lot of people who are different than their siblings. Their siblings have a more kind of idle or lazy mindset, and they have a more ambitious and entrepreneurial mindset. The differences in their lives are drastic. And the fact of the matter is that to the extent that you have a lazy mindset, you're always going to blame someone else for your situation. But to the extent that you're a go-getter, to the extent that you're ambitious, to the extent that you don't take this attitude of caring what other people think about you, you're less inclined to blame other people for your problems. And what's funny to me is that when you look at somebody like a LeBron James, or when you look at somebody like, an individual who have come into success, not through journalism, but by actually doing something of substance, something of value, you'll find that if they are Black, to the extent that they do kind of speak into this racial kind of problem that we have, they do so in a way that seems to be more scripted because they know they don't believe it. They know that they're just saying the things that they think they're supposed to say. But in Tavis Smiley's situation, he says it and it's more convincing. He says it and it comes off as though, wow, he actually believes this. Why is that? Well, Tavis Smiley's line of work is journalism. Tavis Smiley's line of work is a mere kind of trafficking in ideas, a trafficking in the abstract, not so much a trafficking in real world experiences. And so Tavis Smiley's whole objective is to push a narrative. And you'll find that when it comes to intellectuals, individuals who have no, again, practical experience in the real world, who only look at ideas and other intellectuals, these are the most dangerous people to society because I mean, again, for me, it goes back to the Bible where it says that there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is death. It also goes back to another verse that says, lean not into your own understanding, but in all your ways, trust God. These intellectuals don't trust God. These intellectuals lean into their own understanding. These intellectuals go more off of impulse than they do in what God's objective moral standard says. And so they want anything but God. They want to do anything but go God's way. And so because they want to do anything but go God's way, their ideas will always result in more death, damnation, and destruction, not a resolution. Their ideas don't resolve anything. But because they continue to double and triple and quadruple down on the very insistence of holding this posture of experts and thought leaders and trendsetters, because they maintain that kind of posture and position, society suffers all the more. So, John Wood says that it's not, John Wood says, I won't go as far as Tavis Smiley in saying it's only racism. I'm going to say that it's also classism, says John Wood. Both are wrong. Both are wrong. Both are wrong to the extent that it negates the role of personal responsibility on this question.
Was having to lay on the floor,
Sure.
in the midst of gunshots and fires and sirens. A woman who's seen more death in her life in the projects than many people serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. And she got out, but for people who are still in that environment in 2022, across this whole arc of American history, I ask people, I say, when does the American dream ever show up for disproportionately many African Americans? The useful differentiator for me, to a great degree, is class. I say, our class positionality is not detached from the racial history, right? Neither are the operations of our institutions. But race alone is not enough to explain how it is I have an experience the way I have, and that my wife has an experience that she has, without introducing the socioeconomic reality.
Sure.
So he says that class plays a larger role. What you have in your bank account plays a larger role in the degree by which you're decent and the degree by which you achieve in life. Nonsense. I know plenty of poor people who are living decent lives, whose plight in life, whose station in life is better now than it was 5 years ago, because they are making the necessary moves to elevate their station, regardless of where they are on the rung. Just because you're poor or just because you don't have a lot of money doesn't mean that you're doomed to be permanently in that position, especially in America. America has, all of its warts and bruises. Don't get me wrong. And that, in my opinion, is thanks in large part to the kind of toll that the leftist social engineers has had on our country in the name of progressivism. I feel like they've done far more damage than they have good. But the reality is, we are not a caste system. And when it comes to the fact that you are born to the parents that you're born to, we do have an excess in information, an abundance of information, especially in the digital age with YouTube and other such things. There's no excuse to be kind of relegated, if you will, to a kind of mindset that leaves you idle and lazy. There's many ways up and out of your situation. It's just a matter of what you will do about your situation. And so for them to sit up there and say that it's anything but personal responsibility, I think is to mislead people. I have a few more clips for you before I close this out. Let's see. This goes back into the essence of what I titled the show, which is Tavis Smiley and the Savior Complex. And I want to show you how these quote unquote black leaders see themselves as saviors. They've rejected Christ as savior. They rejected the word of God, and they have assumed that position for themselves.
Class. I think of class on two levels. I think of class writ large in this country. And clearly there's a class warfare that is being engaged right now. But I also think of class intra-Black America. And what concerns me most about class intra-Black America is that we are getting worse and worse about this class divide in our own community. Chris Rock famously told the joke years ago that there are black folk and there are niggas, and even black folk don't like niggas. You recall that joke?
I do. Oh, yeah.
What Chris is really getting at in that joke is class warfare inside the black community. And so we're sort of turning on each other. And those African Americans who have made it, oftentimes, start to demonize, and behave in ways that I think further disenfranchise our brothers and sisters who have not made it. Which leads me to the third movement in this orchestra, if you will. The third movement is simply this. Yeah, the third movement is, as I see it, that we have to acknowledge in this country that while there are individual African Americans who have done well, that says nothing about the collective. And that's what concerns me. So it's not just class intra-Black America. It's this notion that some of us have made it, but most of us have not. And it's always been that way. America has always been okay with keeping the names of a few Negroes in their mouths. Mm. But writ large, they don't seem to be concerned about the larger masses of our people. Right. What I'm concerned about is how do we save the masses of these Negroes who are being left farther and farther behind every year? That's what keeps me. If there's anything that keeps me up at night, it's that.
How do we save the masses of these Negroes? That's the thing that keeps Tavis Smiley up at night. It's not your job to save the masses of these Negroes. That's not your job. And even if that were your job, even if you did take on that role, take on that task, you're doing it wrong. You guys forget, this is the same guy who, along with Cornel West, bought a bus or rented a bus, and they went on what they called the poverty tour. And the whole objective of the so-called tour was to build a kind of coalition among poor people in America to use the strength of numbers to put pressure on the Obama administration and on Congress at the time to pass legislation and to introduce policies with the effort of eradicating poverty in America. That was the whole objective of their tour. My issue with that is you see the problem and you believe that the solution is more government. You see, the so-called problem and you believe that the solution is more socialist policies. Your solution is wrong. Your solution should be to teach a man to fish. Your solution should be to invest in trade schools or invest in, private level programs that seek to teach young folks skills to where they don't see, the people that they see who are successful isn't only the drug dealer, but also the carpenter, the plumber, the electrician, the auto mechanic, the educator, the people, the chef, the farmer, the people who are actually doing things that are productive in society. So on the one hand, you promote people like, Kiki, what was her name? Kiki Palmer and Cornel West and all these different poets and writers and people who produce no value whatsoever to society. None. The net result of what they contribute produces zero value, a net zero value in society. So you promote those kind of people on the one hand as Black excellence. And then you wonder, why is there so much disparity among Black folks in America? And the solution that you come up with to do something about what you perceive to be the disparity is to put pressure on the government to push more policies, more socialist policies that will increase and expand the welfare state for Black folks. You are the most counterproductive person on the question of how to advance the skills, on how to elevate the station of Black folks in America. The concept of true progress is and has always been to teach a man to fish. You should be promoting the local farmer more so than a Kiki Palmer. You should be promoting the trade professional You should be promoting the trade professional more than a Cornell West. If you genuinely want to lead in such a way that people actually elevate their station in life, then you would do so by elevating those who are productive instead of those who are destructive. I have a few more clips. What am I? I'm at an hour and 7 minutes. I don't want to go over an hour and a half. Looks like I'm going to be able to get through all of them. But the question was asked to Tavis Smiley, whose fault is it that poor people are poor? I wanted to play his response to that question. Let's see. Culture in the outro, racism chooses. I already did that one. The church, the melanin in my skin is why I'm failing. Be who you are. I want to help these Negroes. Okay, here we go. Right here.
Let me ask a question so I can advance the narrative that I think I want to advance, which is two questions. One, whether or not you think that the Black poor are poor because of their own doing, number one. And number two, let me ask whether or not you think that there has been enough focus on elevating poor people out of that condition.
Well, let me answer number two first, because that's easy.
Yeah.
No, I don't think there has been enough focus, whether through philanthropy or public policy or this, that. I mean, it's a complicated question, but no, the simple answer, I think.
It's not a complicated question.
On the first point, the answer is also simple in that, no, I don't think that it is the fault of people in poverty that they're suffering, and Black poverty in particular, that we are suffering the consequences and ramifications of that. But I do want to inject some nuance, because I also don't want to at all, because I do think of myself as fundamentally fairly conservative, although with many different varying angles. I actually like to think of myself as a social justice conservative. There are issues, I think, of
what is that?
Of culture, of behavior, of the way we treat each other, right? That do necessitate some remedy on the level of personal responsibility. I don't think that's enough. I don't think that's enough. But when you're, but I think people have different stations, right? If we're looking,
what is a social justice conservative? The two are mutually exclusive. What is a social justice conservative? What exactly is it that you wish to conserve? Social justice, the whole point of social justice is to destroy meritocracy. The whole point and goal of social justice is equity. Equity and social justice are synonymous. They're interchangeable, those words. Oftentimes when you hear a social justice warrior, they are advocating for equity, which is discriminatory in itself. That's the goal of social justice. And so when you follow the word social justice with conservative, that just doesn't make any sense at all, because a conservative is one who wishes to conserve the free market, conserve the relics of, or the edicts of the Constitution, conserve family values, conserve manhood, conserve traditional womanhood. That's what a conservative is. Here's a problem I have with these intellectuals and the way that they convolute and confuse the issue is when you look at something, for example, like criminal justice reform, right? Criminal justice reform for many, and again, these are individuals who are themselves social justice warriors. They use the term criminal justice reform to mask what it is they're really trying to do. What they really want to do is to downplay the urgency or the need to prosecute crime in a civilized society. They want to say that, to the extent that you have individuals who commit crimes, it's not really their fault. It is the fault of their upbringing. It is the fault of their class, which is another word that John Wood uses. It is the fault of the system. systemic racism. This is why Black people are more incarcerated than other ethnic groups um, per capita. This is the reason why, X, 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 Y, 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 and Z. They list all of these things that is the fault, or that is the reason why this criminal committed this crime, other than the fact that they made a personal or personal choice to do so. And so what they wish to do is to roll back the forcefulness in the degree by which we go after crimes and go after criminals. And so this doesn't have a positive effect, a net positive effect on a society, especially a society that wishes to be a civilized society. Because to the extent that law-abiding citizens can't live peacefully within their own houses, to the extent that children can't play safely outside or our elderly can't walk safely down the street, to the extent that you go into a neighborhood and there's broken glass, there is a strong stench of urine, there is graffiti on the walls, this, and that, it's going to be unsafe. And when it's unsafe, when it's unpleasant, criminality is sure to follow. And so if you want a safe, secure, and clean society, you need to be hard on crime. This is just a fact. It has nothing to do with race. You need to necessarily be hard on crime. And so, again, when it comes to this notion that it's not the poor people's fault that they're poor, what they're getting at, whether you're a social justice conservative, whatever the heck that means, or whether you are a full-on Marxist like a Tavis Smiley, when it comes to this notion of saying that poverty is not the fault of those who are themselves poor, I would agree with that if what you mean is the parents are poor and thus their children are poor, right? But there comes a certain age where agency kicks in and you are exposed to information that you choose to reject that information. You choose to neglect taking advantage of opportunities to elevate your station in life. It is to that extent that it does become your fault. And so it's a more nuanced conversation than what they are suggesting here. Because when I got into the plumbing industry as a young apprentice out of high school, I went from making $7.25 an hour, which was minimum wage at the time, to making $16 an hour as an entry-level apprentice. And I thought to myself, wow, this is really good money. My friends who I went to high school with were still making minimum wage. And I said, hey, come down to the apprenticeship with me and apply. You'll make more than $10 more than what you're making now, or almost $10 more than what you're making now. It's great. I'm learning so much. They began to ask more questions. And I told them, yeah, with the apprenticeship, you're working, 5 hours a day. You're working during the day and you're learning, but you also have to go to school 2 nights a week because it's an apprenticeship. You're learning the practical work in the field, but you're also learning the book work at night. You're learning the concept of what you're doing. So you're not just an installer. You're not just a hand. You're also somebody who you're a professional in that you know the concept and the why behind what it is you're installing. And so this is a perfect apprenticeship to get into. When they learned that they actually have to go to school, they said, no, I'm not interested. This was 13, 14 years ago. Last I checked, those same friends are still making minimum wage. If they're not making minimum wage, they're making maximum $15 an hour. They were presented with an opportunity. They chose not to take advantage of that opportunity. And so when it comes to them, I would say that yes, poverty is a choice. Yes, their situation is a choice. I'm not going to look at a 40-year-old man and say that poverty is not his fault because he was born into a poor family. No. There comes a time, there comes an age where agency kicks in, where opportunities are made manifest. And you have the choice to make as to whether you will take advantage of those opportunities or not. As far as the child is concerned, that child has no choice. So yes, I do believe that, if the question of whether poverty is your fault or not, if we're talking about children, the answer is no. If we're talking about adults, the answer is yes. Poverty is a choice. Problem solved. Next question, please. Let's see how John would answer the question.
The macro problem, we've got to aim for policies.
And again, notice how like these intellectuals, they like to deal in the abstract and bring up all this other nonsense. Like, no, answer the question. Is poverty a choice? Answer: yes, if you are an adult. No, if you are a child. Now, I understand things happen. If you're a woman and your husband works and you stay at home and he gets hurt or injured somehow, and you guys, go through your savings account and you run out of money, you obviously are going to drop down a few notches, in the tax bracket. And so I understand that there are, situations that one can't help and things of this nature. But again, information is key. The fact of the matter is there is a lot of information out there that can help even in those scenarios, such as getting life insurance policies where, I have a life insurance policy where if I were to get hurt, at work or what have you, I can basically get that money to help, support the family because I'm injured or what have you. So, we made conscious decisions. If I were to die, my wife and my kids will get an insurance policy. They'll be able to maintain on that money until she remarries or what have you. So it's like, there's decisions that you make. And so I feel like even to the extent that unforeseeable things happen, if you consider yourself to be a leader, Tavis Smiley or John Wood or, whomever, like you're putting your attention in the wrong things instead of trying to push for policies, legislative policies that increases the welfare state. Educate people on life insurance policies, educate people on, things that will actually help them, teach them to fish. But they're not, like, the fact is they want to push a policy, and it's a bonus if their name is attached to that policy because they wish to have their legacy solidified as one who helped push legislation that one can look at you and say, oh, this person was a great leader and that they did this. See, when you teach a man to fish, it decentralizes the thing. When you teach a man to fish and then that man goes and teach another man to fish and that man goes and teach another man to fish, it becomes this thing of personal responsibility where you're not centralizing an idea around a singular person, right? Whereas if you push legislative policy, it does become the centralized thing that, to the extent that everyone is provided for under this particular policy, you can credit that back to the Tavis Smiley policy, the Tavis Smiley Act. You know what I'm saying? You understand where I'm going with this? You want for people to succeed because of the Tavis Smiley Act, more so than the fact that dad in house 1 made a way for his children, dad in house 2 made a way for his children, dad in house 3, house 4, house 5, so on and so forth. You see, when you decentralize it, you teach a man to fish, who then in turn teaches another man to fish, who then in turn teaches another man to fish. It becomes less about you and then more about the responsibility of the individual. But because they insist upon being a name, because they insist upon being a celebrity, because they insist upon being a quote unquote leader, they would much rather make it all about them, not realizing that making it about them encourages more idleness and de-incentivizes work ethic, and thus causes more disparity than the kind of quote unquote help that you say you wish to bring about. Let me finish this clip.
That can help address that on that level. Do necessitate some remedy let me
Sure.
answer number two
Sure.
first, because that's easy.
Yeah.
No, I don't think there
Right.
has been enough focus, whether through philanthropy or public policy or this, that. I mean, it's a complicated question, but
Yeah,
no.
yeah.
But the simple answer, I think, is no.
Okay.
On the first point, the answer is also simple in that no, I don't think that it is the fault of people in poverty that they're suffering, and Black poverty in particular, that we are suffering the consequences and ramifications of that. But I do want to inject some nuance, because I
Please.
also don't want to at all, because I do think of myself as fundamentally fairly conservative,
Right.
although with many different varying
Sure.
angles. I actually like to think of myself as a social justice conservative. There are issues, I think, of culture, of behavior, of the way we treat each other,
Mhm.
right? That do necessitate some remedy on the level of personal responsibility. I don't think that's enough.
Sure,
I don't think
sure.
that's enough. But
Sure.
when you're, but I think people have
For those of you who missed it just now, he says that I think that there are some components of personal responsibility that are to blame, to the question of why a person is poverty, but he doesn't think it's enough to make a difference. In other words, what he's saying is that he thinks that political policies, have more of an influence on whether a person is poor or not than the actual decisions that a person makes. And so if personal decisions were right here, as to be a factor as to why a person is poor, and here we have what the government does or does not do, political policies that do or don't exist, he would quantify it like this: personal responsibility has some to do, but not very much. But political policies have a lot more to do, as to whether a person's poor or not. So the fact that you're quantifying it in that way, again, it discredits you bigly when it comes to whether anyone should listen to you on this question, because you're not being honest with that quantifier.
different stations, right?
Mhm.
If we're looking at the macro problem, we've got to aim for policies that can help address that on that level. I know many people in my life who act in ways that are self-destructive because their parents were self-destructive, because they grew up in environments where they were, dad was abusive. You're more likely to be abusive to your kids. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility, right?
Yeah.
And so, Black people are no different than anybody else. You put white people or any other group. As a matter of fact, we can point to groups of white
Sure.
people in America, in Appalachia and so forth, who do grow up in roughly analogous circumstances and have the same sort of problems. And so
Right.
it's nothing intrinsic to Black Americans in these conditions at all. But, I don't want to completely invalidate the cultural sort of
Sure.
relevance here.
I asked
So he says he doesn't want to invalidate culture's responsibility to the question of why there are disparities, why there are poor people, so on and so forth. He doesn't want to invalidate it, but he doesn't also at the same time, he doesn't want to give it its due in terms of acknowledging to what extent does it play a role in the disparities that we're talking about. That is to say, he doesn't want to give it its rightful quantity of blame, and he wants to rather instead focus on what the government is or is not doing, what the policies are, such and so forth. And so when you tell me that you're a conservative or a social justice conservative, I mean, I would quantify it in the same way. I would say that your social justice is up here and your quote unquote conservatism is way down here. I'm actually honestly very interested in learning to what extent, like what is your definition of conservatism? Because you, like Tavis Smiley, are placing a lot of stock in who Martin Luther King is and what Martin Luther King has done, more so than what the responsibility of the individual is. I want you to listen to, speaking of King, and this again, this tells me everything I need to know. This clip I'm about to show you all tells me everything I need to know about who these people worship, what altar they worship at, and what it is that drives them. Listen to this.
I am most interested in trying to figure out in conversation with people who would ask for my support on any number of issues and fronts. My fundamental question is, what is your relationship to the legacy of Martin King?
Yes.
That's my fundamental
Yes.
question. I want to know what your relationship is to the legacy of MLK before I put myself out there to support you in any sort of way. Racism, poverty, and militarism. Yeah. What again is your relationship to the legacy of King? And how do you see those three issues in late modernity? Right. And how America is advancing or not advancing or regressing on those issues. That's the way I look. That's the prism through which I look, and the prism through which I judge people who want to and would call themselves leaders in this community and in this country.
Again, I don't look to Christ. I don't look to the Bible. I don't look where they stand on righteousness according to God's word. I look at where they stand on King's legacy, Martin Luther King's legacy. Are you hearing this? I don't look to the Bible. I don't look at, you know what I mean? Because the Bible says not to be unequally yoked. The Bible asks, what union does light have with darkness? Does believers have with unbelievers? That's what the Bible says. Tavis Smiley doesn't look to that. He looks, where do you stand on Martin Luther King's legacy? Ironically enough, I look to the same thing. Whenever a person professes to be a leader, where do you stand on Martin Luther King's legacy? Only the answer I look for is different than what Tavis Smiley looks for. Because to the extent that you worship at the altar of Martin Luther King, Tavis Smiley says, you're good with me. You're good in my book. We're fighting for the same things. But in my book, when I ask that question, and if you validate Martin Luther King and he was a hero and he was a good man, this and that, what that tells me is that you lack discernment. Now, I'll give you a pass if you haven't heard the things that I talk about, that Chuck Littleton talks about, that we expose in Uncle Tom Part 2, that we're about to expose in Uncle Tom Part 3. But hey, apart from my circle, there has been plenty of other people who have exposed Martin Luther King and the fact that he was an actual Marxist. He was an adulterer. He didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in the resurrection. He didn't write any of his own speeches. He plagiarized his dissertation to get his PhD. So he, you know, the fact that he even was a PhD is questionable. All the things. He was a facade. Martin Luther King was. I'm not saying that because I hate the man. I'm not saying that because I have any kind of personal animosity toward him. I'm saying that because these are the facts. He was lionized. He was made to appear larger than life. And how one responds to the knowledge that he was a facade tells me everything I need to know about your judgment. If you have only ever been taught the kind of public school version of who Martin Luther King was, as being this hero, as being this moral leader, okay, you get a pass because you don't know any better. However, when faced with the facts of who he is, if you still choose to celebrate him as this great man, that tells me that your judgment is not to be trusted. If you're someone who professes to be a leader, if you're someone who professes to be a policymaker or a trendsetter, I don't trust you. I don't trust you because you don't know how to deal with the truth. How one responds to the truth tells me everything I need to know about you. I'll give you guys a quick story. So Virgil Walker and Daryl B. Harrison, they have a podcast called Just Thinking. I interviewed both of them for Uncle Tom Part 2. And I remember listening to them speak. And Daryl B. Harrison reminds me a lot of myself in that he takes a very kind of matter-of-fact approach on this question and let the chips fall where they may. Virgil Walker does the same thing, but I noticed something about Virgil Walker, and that is, you know, whenever he would speak, sometimes he would quote something that Martin Luther King said in a positive way. And that kind of bothered me because, you know, you have to understand at the time I was doing a ton of research on who Martin Luther King really was. and understanding and realizing that a lot of like his speeches or the things that people quote him of having said wasn't actually him that had originated these ideas. It was more or less a kind of disingenuous thing where he used his oratory skills to say it so as to convince people that he was this moral leader. And in fact, he didn't even write the speeches. It was Bayard Rustin, who was a communist, Stanley Levison, who was a communist, or Clarence B. Jones, who was, guess what, a communist. And they were, in a sense, giving Martin Luther King these things to say because he was so good at saying them, so as to trick everybody into believing that he was this great moral leader. And the idea of making you believe that he was this great moral leader was to give us the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the, all of the other acts and policies that he was trying to push to, again, turn America into a socialist country. You have to take my word for it. Just listen to his own words toward the end of his life, saying that he wants for there to be a mass redistribution of wealth, i.e. socialism. He wants a mass universal basic income, socialism. And so I remember pulling Virgil Walker aside whenever him and Daryl came to Fort Worth. They were invited to a church to speak. And then, at that church, this was like a year and a half ago, he quoted something that Martin Luther King said. And so later on in the hallway, I pulled him aside and said, hey, that quote wasn't written by Martin Luther King, right? It was written by, I think it was Stanley Levison or something like that, who was a communist. And this was the whole reason why they wanted him to say it and this and that. And I said that not expecting it to get anywhere. Later on, I wrote a and the reason I didn't expect it to get anywhere is because, like, I understand that when it comes to Martin Luther King, for a lot of people, it's very complicated because he was lionized to such a degree that that people can acknowledge that, okay, he was a Marxist, but at the same time, this thing that he is credited for saying is universally a good thing. And so I'm going to, in a sense, take the meat without the bones. So there are people that come to that conclusion. And, although I don't personally come to that conclusion, I understand it, right? So that's what I expected Virgil Walker to do with that information that I gave him. Later on, I wrote a piece. It was like a blog post or whatever. And I shared it with Virgil Walker, and he dealt with the information in that piece way better than I expected him to. And in fact, he wrote his own piece later on exposing the Marxism of Martin Luther King. That was even stronger and more compelling piece than I wrote because he's a better writer than I am, Virgil Walker. And so the fact is, the information that I and others were putting out concerning who Martin Luther King really was a truth that someone like a Virgil Walker dealt with in good faith. And because he is a man who himself is in pursuit of God's truth, he was able to, in a sense, shake off the misconceptions and the mispreconceived notions that he had concerning who Martin Luther King was. He rejected that. He came to reject that in pursuit of what is actually true. So when I look at somebody like a Virgil Walker, I have a lot of respect and admiration for him because here's a man who's not going to lean on nostalgia. He's going to lean on the truth. There are others, however, whose name I will not mention, people who you all know and love personally, in this kind of Black conservative movement, as it were, who, after having heard the truth, rejected me, cussed me out in some cases, and said Martin Luther King was a great man. You don't understand. You're too young. This, and that. And for me, like, upon hearing that, it became abundantly clear, especially looking at their work after the fact, that this is a person who is vain, who is only interested in expanding their own name, making much of themselves, and then making much of Christ. And they might use Christianity, they might quote a verse and this and that, but the reality is, at the end of the day, they're just using that, much the same as they're using Martin Luther King's quotes, or much the same as they're using, whatever, to make much of themselves. And so how one responds to the truth and coming to the knowledge of that truth tells me whether or not you are really equipped to be a leader for the sake of advancing God's kingdom, or whether you're using this posture of leadership to expand your own name, to make much of your own name. And for me, I'm not about to sit here and help you make much of your own name, just like I'm not going to require anyone to make much of my name. I'm not going to beg anybody to be on their podcast. I'm not going to beg anybody to, accept my line of thinking. I'm not going to beg you. If you're going to listen to what I have to say, I'd rather you do so on a voluntary basis. I'd rather you do so in good faith. And I want to have conversations with people. I want to hear people out. And I also want to be heard, but I'm not going to beg you for anything. Being in the spaces and in the circles that I sometimes find myself in, you see people throwing elbows to get at the front of the line. Those people disgust me. Those people absolutely disgust me. And I'm not jealous of their numbers. I'm not jealous of their platforms. I'll name one name, David Harris Jr., a repulsive man. This man will do anything to be a celebrity. Again, I have no personal animosity for him. I'm just calling it as I see it. But he'll quote a verse. He'll quote the scriptures. But here's an individual who has more of an interest in making much of his own name than making much of the name of Christ. And so again, what one does with the information of the truth, tells me everything I need to know about you. According to Tavis Smiley, what one does and how receptive one is of the legacy of Martin Luther King is what makes that person a great person in Tavis Smiley's mind. We'll let the clip continue.
Okay, before I put myself out there to support you in any sort of way. Racism, poverty, and militarism. What again is your relationship to the legacy of King, and how do you see those three issues in late modernity, and how America is advancing or not advancing or regressing on those issues? That's the way I look. That's the prism through which I look, and the prism through which I judge people who want to and would call themselves leaders in this community and in this country.
So that is how he assesses whether a person is equipped or qualified to be a leader, whether or not they accept that Martin Luther King is a patron saint. Noted. I wanted to end it with this last clip. Looks like we're about to be at an hour 45. I'm okay with an hour 45. I wanted to play this last clip. In this clip that I'm about to show you all, I think it's reminiscent of this notion that a lot of these Black intellectuals have, that they are in fact the owners of the church, that the church doesn't belong to God. The church doesn't belong to Christ. The church, the Bible teaches that the church is the bride of Christ, right? According to these Black intellectuals, no, it ain't. According to these Black intellectuals, the church belongs to them. The church belongs to them to use for, to further the cause of social justice. That's what the church is for. I wanted to show you an example of this.
Neglect of Black communities where we have not, in my mind, invested in the institutions of community that make it possible for people who are trying their damnedest to live a better life, because the vast majority of them are, to actually gain some footing in that direction. And so that becomes a matter of affordable housing. That becomes a matter of quality education. That becomes a matter, I would argue, of the church being engaged with the community and not so inwardly focused that they're not worried about anything other than tithes and who gets to be a deacon.
Okay, so what? He's complaining that the church is inwardly focused. The church is supposed to be inwardly focused. What are we talking about? The Bible supports the notion that the church is supposed to be inwardly focused. When it comes to widows, for example, I think it says, and I forget where it says it, but you see evidence to the question of which widows should be supported by the church. first and foremost, the Bible makes it clear that it should be the older women who has served the church and have served those within the church and who, only had one husband and this and that. So the Bible says in terms of who should be served by the church. When you look at the church in the book of Acts and the fact that they were doing life together and the fact that they were doing many things together, it was this kind of inward focus. And not only that, when you look at the inward focus of the early church and you look at the inward focus of other religious communities today, whether it be the Jews, the Mormons, the Muslims, so on and so forth, they have an inward focus that works well for them, and they're able to produce children who then go on and do great things, who lead good lives, secure, safe lives for their children, so on and so forth. But there's this emphasis on the American church and on the Black church that, no, we're supposed to focus on the world. We're supposed to focus on the world. And they justify that. They try to justify that with scripture in saying that, Jesus had to go to the ends of the earth, baptizing people in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Great. I get it. There are a lot of churches that do missions work, but I feel like a lot of people use that as an excuse to not focus inwardly, to not focus on the body, to not focus on the needs of those within the body. Not only physical needs, but also needs in the way of edification and spiritual and prayer and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is, most of those who argue that there should be a deeper emphasis on what goes on outside of the church than what goes on inside of the church, what you'll find oftentimes is, even though they are saying that we need to go out and reach the world, what you find is that the opposite is true. The world has reached them, that they are more influenced by those outside of the church than those outside the church who are connected with them are influenced by them. I don't feel like I'm doing as great of a job as I could in breaking this down for you all, but I'll try it again. When it comes to these individuals who say that there should be an emphasis on outward focus than on inward focus when it comes to the church, what you oftentimes find is that even though they're saying that, those who are immediately connected to them outside of the church have more of an influence on them than they do on those others. And so at this point, to me, what you're saying is mere rhetoric. What you're saying is mere rhetoric. You're using excuses as to why you don't place an emphasis on being inwardly focused when it comes to the church. I think that there should be more inward focus. To me, the kind of summation I get from the Bible with regard to the posture of the church is that the church is supposed to be inward focused, yet approachable. In other words, it is an elite group. It is an exclusive group, but it doesn't keep others out. The only way it keeps others out is if those are people who call themselves deconstructionists, people who insist upon blaspheming the Holy Spirit, people who insist upon promoting indulgence and decadence and sin. These are the people who are kept out. But to the extent that a person is genuinely growing or wants to come to know Christ or wants to look for community within the church is supposed to accept those people with open arms. However, again, this notion that we must become that we must look like the world in order to reach it, and you accept that because you misinterpret Paul, only to then look like the church and to keep Jesus out, which has become the case for people like the Potter's House, T.D. Jakes, and others. Whenever you tell me that you did this to reach people, I just say that you're using that as an excuse. The reality is, we need to focus inwardly when it comes to the church, that we might raise children, that we might do life together and meet needs of those who we have union with under the leadership, the hierarchy of Christ. Because what union do we have with unbelievers? Unbelievers who aren't indifferent to our faith, but are hostile and are taught to be hostile, are conditioned to be hostile to our faith. When you hear these pundits, these left-wing pundits saying that Christianity and religion is dangerous and all these things, you might think that they're just, moving their lips and making words come out. But the reality is they are speaking to younger and younger generations who, once they come of age, these are going to be your future voters, your future lawmakers, your future leaders, so on and so forth, who have been trained to believe that religion and Christianity in particular is dangerous, and they will take a more hostile approach to you as a Christian, as a believer, that can possibly become physical violence. Right now it's rhetoric, tomorrow it's physical violence. And so, yes, we should be inwardly focused. We should be focusing on strengthening the faith to not only endure spiritual warfare, but also physical warfare should it ever come. We should focus on building the quality of the church rather than trying to build the quantity of the church. God will add to the numbers. To the extent that you're focusing on being faithful to God, to the scriptures, to each other, to the extent that you're focusing on being faithful, God will add to your numbers. We see this in the book of Acts. God was adding daily to the numbers because they were focusing inwardly. They were focusing on building the quality of the faith through edification of those within the church. God was multiplying the church, not them. God was doing that. And so, to the extent that you belong to a local church, if that church is focusing more on, we need to do this, and that to help the community and help others around us, there's nothing wrong with doing that. But if the church is spiritually dead on the inside, there's gossiping on the inside, there's people trying to get over on each other on the inside, there's a lack of prayer and responsibility and accountability on the inside, it doesn't matter what you're doing outside the church. Your good works is like filthy rags, says the Bible. The Bible says that God's not interested in your sacrifices and this, and that. He's interested in your heart. What's your heart look like? This is true not only of you, this is true also of the local church. What does it look like on the inside? Yes, focus inwardly. The emphasis of the church should not be Black culture. The emphasis of the church should be the church. That's what the emphasis should be. But when it comes to the so-called Black church, this is an entity that doesn't belong to Christ. This is an entity that is not the bride of Christ. This is rather an entity that is the kind of platform for so-called social justice warriors to masquerade and to placate and to build numbers and to push social justice and to push policy that they believe will help save their quote unquote people. Not from spiritual damnation as a result of their sin, but from the burden of having to be responsible and a meritocracy. Anyway, that's all I have for today. I wanted to get to the comments, but I guess the clips lasted far longer than I wanted to. I should have shared less clips with you guys, but there was so much within that interview between John Wood Jr. and Tavis Smiley that I wanted to share with you all today. So anyway, I will see you all tomorrow, I believe. What's tomorrow? Thursday? I'll see you all tomorrow. I'll see you all Thursday, and then I'll see you all Friday, where I will be doing a live with Jambalaya Talks, and Keisha King will be discussing education. You don't want to miss that, because we're going to take an approach that I think is different than a lot of other rhetoric or a lot of other lives or podcasts that you have seen in the past concerning education. So But yeah, I love you all. God bless. I will see you next time. Take care.